This is the second part of my series into the Cathedral. To briefly recap, there are two different but similar factions that have monopolized power over the society of Western countries, especially so for the United States. Those factions are the neoliberals and the Cathedral. The Cathedral consists of courts, universities, and the mainstream media. In the first part of this series, I focused on courts in the United States. This video will discuss the public schools and universities. Number 1. The public schools. No man has had more of an influence on education in the United States than Horace Mann. While few people would know who he is if asked, he has had an outsized influence on the lives of nearly every person living in this country. Mann created the first American public school system in the state of Massachusetts. He believed that the state, rather than parents or the church, was the appropriate institution to educate children. Mann believed that schools were places where politics and religion should not be discussed. He only hired women as teachers at his schools because he believed that women were morally superior to men. Mann's views were informed by his hatred of politics. He described the bitter and partisan U.S. presidential election of 1848, for example, as Saturnalia of license, evil speaking, and falsehood. Mann believed that by removing politics and religion, his schools could teach an objective knowledge through professional teachers. Once all students were taught this watered-down objective truth, everyone would be on the same page. Thus, Mann viewed his educational policy as a method of transcending the demeaning conflict of politics. Horace Mann's critics, both during his time and today, found his beliefs deeply troubling. Instead of creating an alternative to politics that would lead to a superior form of moral consensus, Mann had created a deeply immoral form of social control. Mann's ideas were popular, though, and became the model of education in the United States. The Catholics, in response, created their own Catholic schools because they viewed Mann's philosophy as contradicting Catholic views on morality. Nearly 2 centuries later, our public schools operate under Horace Mann's same philosophy. Politics and religion aren't explicitly taught in our schools. The vast majority of teachers are women. Likewise, the primary function of the public school continues to be a form of social control. Did you enjoy your public school curriculum? If you're anything like me, you probably absolutely hated it. It's boring, very boring. Yet here you are watching this video about me talking about Horace Mann, a guy who lived 200 years ago. So why are you watching this? Probably because of politics. When you have a stake in some sort of moral or political belief, knowledge starts to matter. People like to learn or hear things that validate their moral or political beliefs. Removing politics and religion from public education is like removing all of the moisture from a piece of meat prior to eating it. You end up making the meat dry and indigestible. The legacy of Horace Mann is that education is boring. Millions of students get left behind every year, not because they aren't smart enough. It's because they can't stomach how tedious public education is. Of course, we are supposed to be citizens of a democratic republic. Our education system, more than anything else, ought to prepare us for the art of democracy. Is that not the underlying philosophy behind a liberal education? In order to do so, though, the most important thing for us to teach our children is how to understand and debate politics and morality. This is particularly true for local politics. This is, of course, though, the one thing that public education avoids teaching. Now, were you skeptical earlier when I said that public schools were a form of social control? Okay, well, let me demonstrate it to you then. How much did your public school education focus on blacks? Probably a lot, right? You learned about Harriet Tubman, didn't you? Rosa Parks? What about Malcolm X? Now, did you ever learn anything about Emilio Aguinaldo? Have you even ever heard that name before? The answer is probably not. He's not black. During the late 19th century, Emilio Aguinaldo fought for the independence of the Philippines from the Spanish Empire. When America's Navy began fighting Spain Spain, Aguinaldo allied with the United States and issued a Filipino Declaration of Independence. This was modeled after the American Declaration of Independence. Aguinaldo allied with America because he had a sincere belief that America would liberate the Philippines. This was based on Aguinaldo's familiarity with American history. America is, of course, the first colonial subject to fight for its independence from an empire. America easily beat Spain and took all of its colonies during the Spanish-American War. Yet instead of granting independence to Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and other Spanish colonies, we basically appointed regional governors to serve as de facto dictators of these territories. These regional governors allowed for things like the institution of slavery to continue in certain parts of the Philippines. This was true until World War II. By the way, during World War II, there were more Filipinos living in America than there were black people. America knew that Japan was likely to invade its Pacific territories. Just like Spain, though, it was willing to sacrifice those territories because it just didn't care about them. The United States pulled its Navy and Air Force back to Hawaii so as not to get tied up in a Pacific war. Unexpectedly, Japan bombed the American fleet in Pearl Harbor. Had it just attacked the Pacific colonies, it's not clear America would have done anything. Aguinaldo welcomed the Japanese invaders as he had the Americans. He thought maybe now that Asians had conquered the Philippines that it might be eventually granted independence. But that didn't happen. Instead of freeing the Philippines, the Japanese looted the country. When the American Navy began winning battles in the Pacific, the Japanese began mass rapes of Filipino women. The Japanese did the same thing on other American colonies that they had conquered. Yet no one talks about all these people. American history books barely mention them. I mean, they're clearly not as important as black people, right? This is what I mean when I talk about social control. Our public schools omit information that could be used to criticize the American empire. Meanwhile, they validate the moral authority of the public school system by endlessly focusing on civil rights and black people. Number 2. The universities. Whenever a conservative criticizes higher education in the United States, they're labeled a anti-intellectual. What? Are you some sort of science denier? It's funny how hypocritical the left is when criticizing organized religion. The major Western and Eastern religions reflect deep moral traditions and philosophies expanded over centuries. Yet the left has no problem easily dismissing these traditions as myths that are irrelevant to politics today. What? Are you some sort of wisdom denier? The reality is the university was once a great American institution. Today, a lot of great research continues on academic disciplines like physics and chemistry. For the remaining sciences, and especially the social sciences, there continues to be some good research, but you have to sift through an awful lot of garbage to find it. Universities and academics therefore cannot be completely disregarded. After all, Thomas Sowell is a college professor. Patrick Deneen is a college professor. Jonathan Haidt is a business school professor. These professors who scan the political spectrum from a libertarian to a conservative and a centrist have all greatly contributed to my understanding of politics. So how is it that our universities transformed themselves into the cathedral? Well, two things contributed. The first is that after World War II, we had this GI Bill which made universities very popular with the middle class. It was no longer just wealthy elites going to college, but also ordinary people. Secondly, over the second half of the 20th century, people either stopped going to church or churches became secular. Like Horace Mann's public schools, the secular churches ceased focusing on tough issues of morality and religion. They instead opted for boring and uncontroversial moral truisms. Things like it's better to love people than hate them. This ended up creating a power vacuum. People needed and wanted moral guidance. The universities ended up deciding that they ought to be the institution that would fill this void. In the late 1960s, black activism became increasingly radical. This was the era of the Black Power movement and the Black Panthers. A tactic commonly used by black activists was to arm themselves with guns and occupy campus buildings. These students would demand a new academic department, Black Studies. Well, what is the point of having a fake academic discipline like Black Studies? Well, universities found a use for them. They would be used to fill in the moral vacuum on campus. Black Studies and later Women's Studies, Native American Studies, and Gender Studies studies would become the new morality controlled by the Cathedral. Because the hard sciences also needed its own moral cause, global warming became part of the Cathedral's fake morality as well. If you disagree with the university's positions on global warming, such as opposing a Green New Deal, you will be the subject of shaming and moral attacks. You're a science denier. You're ignoring the consensus of tens of thousands of scientists. You must be some sort of inbred hillbilly. If you disagree with intersectionality or systemic racism, you are a sexist, racist, bigoted Nazi. As universities have become centers of this new type of pseudo-morality, conservatives have been either reluctant to work for them or unable to get hired. This isn't surprising given the consensus in universities that conservatives are nothing but immoral, stupid racists. Now this chart breaks down academic disciplines by party affiliation. I took the data to make my own easier to read chart. If you look, you'll see that for every 20.8 Democrat biology professors, there is one Republican. For every 25.3 Democrat environmental scientist, there is one Republican. For every 43.8 Democrat sociology professors, there is one Republican. Now, what we don't know is what percentage of these Republican professors are actually socially conservative. I would imagine very few of them disagree with intersectionality or systemic racism. When left centrist Dr. Jordan Peterson took such a position, he became a hated figure on the left. They reacted to him as if he was some sort of heretic. With such pronounced political bias in the academy, our universities have become echo chambers. Peer review is no longer serving the purpose that it needs to. Studies making ridiculous partisan claims end up getting published and validated. This bias was illustrated in the late 1990s by the Sokol affair. Alan Sokol was a physics professor who wrote a deliberately nonsense research article about quantum gravity. The article consisted of meaningless, incomprehensible jargon. It also positively referenced several left-wing political causes, such as socialism and abortion. Despite being a total fraud of an article, it was accepted for publication. Alan Sokol revealed his scheme, and it created a major scandal in the universities. Alan Sokol's experiment has been replicated recently by center-left professors James Lindsay, Peter Boghossian, and Helen Pluckrose. These academics submitted for publication research articles that were deliberately fake about ridiculous topics. One study focused on rape culture at dog parks. Another discussed how straight people could overcome homophobia by using anal sex toys. Another article consisted of portions of Adolf Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, but changed the German people to women and the Nazis to men. All of these studies I just described were selected for publishing. When the hoax was revealed, the three professors became hated figures among the Cathedral. For exposing the bullshit academic studies that were being published, they're now considered racist alt-right trolls by the academy. The profound academic bias and echo chamber-like environment in the universities has resulted in a replication crisis. For example, a 2016 poll of university scientists indicated that 70% of the people responding to the poll had failed to reproduce the result of another scientific study. Meanwhile, 14% responding to the poll admitted to knowing someone who had created a fake study. Even worse, college professors increasingly see the university's purpose as a platform for activism. There are many college professors, for example, who have joined Antifa and engaged in street violence. A professor cannot be a biased activist while at the same time an objective minister of truth. These objectives contradict each other. For all of these reasons, I'd be very skeptical of anyone who claims that universities and academics are the only people or institutions whose political opinions matter. This is especially true when the people expressing these sentiments are not academics themselves and are constantly sharing their own political views. Remember, the Cathedral promotes only a pseudo-morality. They want you to care about the things they tell you to care about because their biased scientists and academics care about those things. They don't have any actual legitimate moral authority though. You'd be better off seeking answers to moral questions from a church or a Buddhist temple than you would in an American university. But anyways, that's all I have to say on universities as a branch of the Cathedral. If you enjoyed the video, please support small YouTube channels such as my own by subscribing. Thank you.